Good morning, everyone. Hello, everyone. Happy Saturday. Happy Postscript Saturday, APS to our real estate week. I am coming to you live from my home, my front porch. I'm in Northern Virginia. It is a little humid, hot, and sticky out here, so we try and get a little fresh air in the mornings around here because by midday you pretty much want to stay in the air conditioning. But that's August here in Northern Virginia, and it is summertime. It is a beautiful morning, and I'm Nancy Yawner, and I love to join you on Saturday mornings having my coffee and sharing with you a little PS to our real estate week. And what does that mean? It means some behind the scenes at Love to List, the name of my company with Keller Williams, and then also an opportunity to provide you with some information to really educate you, the consumer, as to the value a professional realtor brings to you when you are buying, selling, and investing in real estate. And this month, I have dedicated this month to educating you on some of the big shifts and changes that are happening in our industry. Recently, there was a landmark decision that was ruled on with a National Association of Realtor lawsuit, and the rulings will affect how we do business, how we communicate, how we present things, how we are transparent in our industry. And so it's going to be very interesting. And the new rules and laws, if you will, actually start this month. And so I'm dedicating the month of August to you to, first of all, provide some history of the real estate industry, some practical of the real estate industry, and where we are currently, where I think we might be headed, and I will continue to share with you how these shifts and changes will affect you and how we're managing and navigating these changes so that you have a really good understanding, the consumer, what all of this means. Because if you're not buying and selling right now, you may not be interested, know, or care to know about this information. So this is a resource for you. This will be a resource whether you're buying or selling now, a year from now, a couple of years from now. So I believe it will be relevant information for a long time. So share if you'd like. If you ever want to come back, we're all on YouTube, these Postscript Saturdays. And again, the goal is to be a valuable resource for you. So it's interesting. So before I go forward with kind of the history of real estate, I want to remind you I'm doing a little drawing today. I had shared with you last weekend these several books. The One Thing, which I love, this is for anybody, whether you're in business or not. It's an opportunity to learn what it means to be able to focus on what's most important and get that done, and will help you with your efficiency in life. So The One Thing, also this is my current read, Unreasonable Hospitality. I'm going to enjoy it this month because I'm actually taking a staycation this month. I really don't have, I purposefully have planned not to have any staging Saturdays or appointments so much because everything will get deferred now till September, which I'll talk to you about that in a minute. And then these two other books, if you have any interest in real estate, this is a really good tried and true Millionaire Real Estate Agent and Investing Flip. Now, we had a few people enter the drawing, so thank you. And for those that entered, I will pick at the end of my episode live here today. So just a second, let me take a sip of coffee. This month is my birthday month, and I'm really excited again to take this staycation. And so first of all, before I get into this, let's see, the sun's a little bright there. I do want to have a little disclaimer, okay? I am not a certified teacher, okay? I am not a broker. I do not have my broker's license. I am a realtor, a 35-year realtor. I got my license, my real estate license, 35 years ago. So a lot of what I'm going to be sharing with you is information that I have learned along the way, things that I have read, things that I have listened to from industry leaders. I am not an attorney. I'm not giving you advice. I am simply sharing with you today's episode is all about the history of real estate. So, as I said, it might not be of interest to you right now, but I do think if you want to understand where we are in our real estate industry and how it affects you, it's important to understand kind of the backstory, the history of real estate and the National Association of Realtors. So that's my little disclaimer. And so, first of all, I have my notes, so when I look down, that's the reason. So the National Association of Realtors was actually started during the Industrial Revolution. Around 1908, actually, is when NAR started. And it it's interesting. So that's 116 years ago. As I mentioned, I'm a 35-year realtor. So if you take 35 divided by 116, I'm a little sliver of that history. So 30% sliver of 116 years that I've been a part of this history chain of the National Association of Realtors. So I'm going to share with you a little bit of information prior to my license, and then share some information about since I've had my license and some of the big shifts that I've seen and changes that affected the industry, and kind of where we are today, headed into this important month where we're going to be implementing lots of changes. So 1908. So back then, and for a long time, the if you were a buyer, right? If you were a buyer in the beginning stages of the real estate industry, a seller would line themselves up with a brokerage and in order to get their home sold. So you would list your home with one office, and a buyer, how they would find out about the properties, they would either have to go to the brokerage and see what the brokerage had on the market for that brokerage, or they would have to drive around the neighborhoods to see a for sale sign. So as a buyer, you would call that agent brokerage on the sign, and you would meet that broker at the property, just that one property, because at the time that brokerage realtor could only show the listings that they had in their office, and they would show that listing, and then the buyer would have to go to another sign or to another brokerage. It was a very inefficient way to buy a home. But that's the way it was for a long time. Sellers signed agreements with a brokerage company, and that was just exclusive with that brokerage, in the sense the seller, the agent represented that seller, and the buyer had no representation whatsoever. So if the buyer wanted to, if that property was the right fit for the buyer, the agent would write the contract, and the buyer would have no representation. The buyer would tell the agent what they would like to offer, and that agent would bring that offer to the seller. And that agent would get paid by the seller. So that is how it all started. And it was like that until the 1960s. And it was in the 1960s that they started what we still call today the multiple listing service, also known as MLS. So our multiple listing service actually started in the 1960s. Now, of course, we have everything online today, but back then it was in big books. So what the MLS did, the multiple listing service did, it now allowed that if you're a buyer and you see my for sale sign in someone's yard and you call me and I meet with you and I show you that house and it's not the right fit, and I say, well, based on your criteria, I think you might like this house, this house, this house. So it allowed me, an agent, still had a fiduciary relationship to the sellers, but I was allowed to show you multiple properties, because now sellers got more exposure and it was more efficient for the buyer. They didn't have to go to each separate. Now we could show multiple properties in one day. It was more efficient. Our fiduciary relationship, though, however, was still with the seller, which became problematic because what happened is buyers were assuming that we were representing them, right? Because we were taking them in the car, we were looking at all these properties. And back then, before I started, I am sure a lot of agents shared information that they probably weren't supposed to, because there wasn't a lot of clear rules. Although the rule was that as an agent showing property back then, we were working for the seller, we were being paid by the seller. Okay, so that happened for we would get these. They would get these books of all the houses once a month. You know, big books would be dropped off to the separate brokerages, and then it evolved to, well, maybe the more populated areas would get them twice a week. And then it would evolve to, closer to when I started, we would get these datagrams of updates, and before computers. So the multiple listing service has evolved from, you know, getting information not so timely to like, this is now information today. We have a multiple listing service today, and we just go online, we look at all the listings available in the area, and instantly, whereas back then it wasn't. So a lot of changes, a lot of shifts. When I started back in 1989, we did not yet have buyer agency. So if you came to my office and you were interested in buying a house, I would be obligated to tell you, okay, I do work for the seller. I get paid by the seller, and I do not share anything that you don't want the seller to know. And I certainly won't ask you questions that put you in a precarious situation. Like, I wouldn't ask you a question like, well, how much are you willing to spend? Or, you know, because if you want to offer $200,000 on a $250,000 house, I wouldn't ask you how far you would go to get that offer accepted, because if you told me, I would have been obligated to tell the seller. And so it was very, very complicated. Buyers were feeling very confused, and they wanted to get represented. They wanted to be able to speak freely in front of their agent. They wanted guidance from an agent. They didn't want an agent just driving them around working for the seller and couldn't have a confidential fiduciary type relationship. So in the 90s, and I remember it well, buyer agency came out, and where we now had the ability to not only sign seller agency agreements working for the seller, we had the ability to represent the buyer. And what came out of all of this, which is really important, is what is called cooperative compensation, and which means in our MLS, right, it would show. So as a selling listing agent, when I would go meet with a seller, we would discuss compensation, which is slash commission. And we would discuss, let's just say, how many chickens I'm going to charge you, the seller. And we would have a discussion. Because we have now buyer agency, right, we would have a discussion. Okay, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I'm going to charge you X amount of chickens. And we're going to keep X amount of chickens here on this side of the table, the seller side. If an agent representing the buyer shows and brings us an offer, we're going to co-op that total chicken amount and divide it however we see fit, so that the buyer agency can get a portion of that compensation, since they brought us the buyer and an offer that you're willing to accept. So instead of just all those chickens going to the listing agent, we co-op. We co-op information, we co-op compensation, and that within the MLS. And that since, early 90s, I think, mid 90s, that's how it's been. And agency rules and regulations came really into play. And so since then, up until now, when I meet with a buyer, I explain to them that there's different ways an agent can represent you. And I do the same thing with the seller. For seller, it gets a little complicated, and agency is something that I can get into next weekend. But basically, there's designated agency, dual agency, and dual and designated I'm going to talk about next weekend. But the point is that now with the creation of buyer agency, we had if you're a buyer's agent, you're working for the buyer in terms of you have a fiduciary relationship with that buyer. If you're a listing agent, you're working for the seller. Sometimes you have dual agency, and that's where you're representing both the buyer and the seller. And that's allowed in the state of Virginia. Some agents do it, some agents don't. I don't recommend it for myself. I have a whole best business practice of how I handle dual agency and the options that I give our clients, which again I can talk more about next weekend. But I just wanted to share with you that when buyer agency was created, it was created for a good reason, because buyers were confused, because that listing agent was actually working for the seller, even though they were showing properties and acting like they were working for the buyers. So buyer agency was a huge shift in our industry. And at the time, sellers were like, there's no way I'm paying the buyer's agent. But due to best business practices and how things grew and evolved, it actually was a very, very good setup for everybody. And I personally thought that there was a lot of transparency, because right in the MLS, it shows if you're a buyer's agent, what your compensation is going to be if you bring a buyer to that property. As a seller, if you're a professional agent, you're having the important discussions of how all of that works, what it means to you. And now things are going to change, because the big change, which I'm going to talk about next weekend, is we are no longer allowed in our multiple listing service to show or share what the co-op chicken amount is. We cannot put any compensation in our MLS. So when you think back, when you think back, boy, that sun's in the worst spot, isn't it? When you think back, let's see if I can get in a different spot. When you think back about how it all started, it started for good reason, you know, co-opetition, cooperation, if you will. You know, it was really meant to be more transparent and more clear. And I'm going to share with you next weekend how these lawsuits started and why they started. And it really started because a different state, I'm not going to get into that, but a different state on their forms, how they addressed compensation. And it was really started with this scenario, which I'm going to share with you next weekend. So I felt like it was always very transparent. Now it's going to be interesting how we navigate this new ruling in the lawsuit, which is going to be great information next weekend. So I hope that that was helpful, that you understand kind of like the evolution. And the multiple listing service is a good thing. We want to share and expose the seller's listings. We want buyers to be able to look at property. We want agents to be able to show and sell property on behalf of sellers and buyers. I mean, if you are a professional realtor and you are explaining, educating your client every step of the way about what your role is and how you can represent them and what your options are and that everything is negotiable, and that, you know, there's going to be best business practices that come out of this. And I'm really super excited about it, even though I think a lot of people are a little concerned about the shifts and change, and I understand that. But in my experience in the last 35 years, that change and shifts, ultimately, professionals stand out, and there's a lot of great realtors out there, and it's up to you, the consumer, to really seek out the best of the best, right? You want a realtor that knows the new changes, that understands them, and can help educate you on what your choices are. Matter of fact, I'm headed today to go meet with a seller where we signed a listing agreement last month or a couple months ago. We knew we were putting their house on the market in September. Well, I'm meeting with her today to explain the new rules, and we have to do a new agreement because everything's shifting and changing. And so I'm really looking forward to meeting with this seller, having the opportunity to share this information with her and let her make the decision. And that's the way we've always operated anyways. It's not like me telling you what to do. It's having the discussion, having the conversation. And everything in real estate is about bringing the seller and the buyer together, right? And it's between the buyer and the seller, and it's the market that's going to dictate a lot of how this works out. So again, you may not need this information right now. You may wait until you're looking to buy and sell, but this information will stay here on our YouTube channel. And I hope a little history lesson is helpful. And then next weekend, we're going to get into, okay, now that we've had the history lesson, what does this mean today? What is actually happening today, and how is it going to affect you? And I'm going to talk a lot about the seller side next weekend. And then the following weekend, I'm going to talk about the buyer side. And then the fourth Saturday of the month, it will be more like Q&A. So please send me your questions all month long about the National Association of Realtor lawsuit, anything that you might want to know about the current market conditions and the affairs of real estate. So I really am looking forward to this month. It's really more technical. I'll be going through a lot of the agreements, but it's very useful, especially when you need it. So there you go. That's it. So here's my drawing. Now, I really appreciate the people that sent in their little comments to me or whatnot. So the one book that people responded to was The One Thing. So I'm going to go ahead and do this drawing and see who got the... Oh, it's Jackie Browse. So Jackie Browse, this little book will be coming to you, and I look forward to sending it your way. And in the meantime, I hope everyone's having a great summer, and that thumbs up, lots of love, and keep smiling. And I will see you next Saturday for another episode of our Postscript Saturday, a PS to our real estate week. Okay? All right. Take care, everyone.